Hello, my name's Steve B and I'm a presenter on IndyLive Radio. I present Music and Musings every Friday night at 7. The music, that's 70s classic rock, although we will take the occasional side road. The musings, well, they're thoughts on Scottish independence, politics and world events from my viewpoint, which is that of a grumpy old man. So join me every Friday night at 7 on IndyLive Radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, this is Marley and I'm here to tell you a bit about Daytime Live show, which goes out Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays on IndyLive Radio at 11:30 for a couple of hours. So I present the programme along with Val, and we're there with a variety of guests to chat to each day. Now, at the moment, Wednesday's show is a catch-up edition. It's not live. What we do is we rebroadcast some of the more recent interviews. So we hope we enjoy all of those. Be there at 11:30 on IndyLive Radio. For the news you don't hear elsewhere, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Film, you can watch this again, you can be part of it. It's Independence Live, yeah. A few people asked about YouTube. It'll be YouTube/Independence Live. That's where you'll find the footage.
No Westminster. No Westminster, come on. No Westminster, not for me, not for me. But therefore I'll be your slave. I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, come on. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom, one more. Oh, freedom over me. But before I be your slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Okay, good evening. Welcome to the latest version of Building the Scottish State, and I'm very pleased to have with me this evening Miquel Strubell. He was a longtime Catalan independence activist. So first of all, thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you for inviting me.
Exactly. So just give us the lowdown on the situation in Catalonia with regard to the political prisoners, the trial, and the lawfare, the continuing lawfare that is being directed at the independence movement.
Okay, well, if we have about 4 or 5 hours, I can tell you in detail. It is depressing to see how savage the repression through the courts of what is a particularly clear example of a pure political conflict is proceeding. Spain is not it's not giving way in its prosecution of all the leaders that it can find, all the people involved in the organization of the referendum, although organizing referendums is not illegal under criminal law in Spain. And they're also concocting charges against a leading Catalan politician called Laura Borràs, who's an MP in Madrid. As far as I can see, you know, not even the attorney, the state attorney, really knows what she's being accused of. I mean, it's a lot of these cases are built up on civil guards, Spanish police reports that feed into the reports, you know, fake news straight out of totally unreliable media sources, for instance. But you know, it's Kafkian. I mean, you're guilty until you prove you're innocent, but you can't prove you're innocent because you don't really know what you're being accused of. Although the 9 members of the Catalan government who are now serving long prison sentences, they were sentenced for sedition, and no one is terribly sure what sedition means. And the British authorities said, "Well, on what day was this sedition committed?" And they didn't get an answer because it's a movement. It's a political movement. It isn't a gang of thieves planning to, a bank robbery. And so that makes the whole judicial persecution of the Catalan movement so utterly frustrating, because I've been listening to the latest trial, which is now of members of the Bureau of the Catalan Parliament, and one of the representatives of one of the parties. And what can you see? I mean, there's just no legs to stand on in terms of what they're being accused of, which is gross contempt of court by in regard to constitutional court injunctions that have no legal basis at all. You simply cannot tell a parliament what it can talk about and what it can't talk about. I mean, that is unthinkable in a democracy. So it told the Catalan parliament it could not talk about independence ever, and since the Bureau talked about independence or allowed resolutions to talk about independence, because the Bureau isn't mandated to look into the content of resolutions. It can only look at the formal aspects of them. Well, there they are, standing trial, and there's really no grounds to condemn them, but they will get sentenced.
Yeah, well, I from Corominas, I think I met him when I was there in 2016, and I think that he was up for a €30,000 fine and inhabilitation. I'm not sure whether he would be subjected to jail, but it's still just so ridiculous. It's not even disproportional. I mean, nobody should be charged for anything like that. Tell us about the situation with the main prisoners, Romeva and Forcadell and the others, because they've been able to get out on work release. Is that correct?
They've been granted because they served so much of the sentence in pre-trial detention that not all that long after the sentence was published in October, they qualified for the first step, the first stage of social reinsertion, they call it, which means that most of them, I think now all, were authorized by a judge to be able to go out and do particular activities during the day from Monday to Friday. They had to sleep in the prisons, and they spend the weekends in the prisons. Now, the state attorney again challenged that for the Speaker of the Parliament, Carme Forcadell, and we just heard that the court, which was supposed to hear this this appeal, which is the provincial court, was overruled by the Supreme Court, who is the court that actually condemned them. So probably not a neutral court in actually deciding. And the Supreme Court have just, they haven't even stretched the law. I mean, they have done something which is not contemplated in the law. It's provincial. It's a provincial courts or jurisdiction to decide on applying these measures to prisoners. I was going to say political prisoners, but it's to all prisoners. Mm-hmm. So the Supreme Court more or less hijacked the case so that they could say Carme Forcadell mustn't be allowed even out on those 5 mornings or 5 working days because it isn't, the work she does outside isn't justified enough, which is as unobjective, I was going to say subjective, unobjective word as you can imagine, and that the activities are not related to reinsertion. Well, if a thief is allowed out to do activities, they're not going to be related, obviously, to stealing, but how do you relate them to not stealing? You know, I would think of any social activity, any activity looking after aged parents and so on, would qualify for that. In the meantime, and much more recently, several of these political prisoners have now served a long enough part of their term for the application of an extra grade of leave, which means that they can sleep. They have to sleep 4 nights a week, the Monday to Thursday, in the prisons, but they can work outside on the 5 days, and they can spend the weekend with their families. We have several of these people have young kids that they have hardly seen except through pane glass. You know, I mean, it is inhumane completely, and there's now a debate on saying, well, the Supreme Court is obviously working towards disqualifying that decision as well. It's sheer revenge, Mark. There's no other word for it, and it's not me that's saying it. I mean, you can see it all over the press.
Okay.
In the meantime, the Supreme Court in Madrid has brought down from 4-year prison sentences to 2.5-year prison sentences. They brought down prison sentences. For whom? Well, for some extreme right-wing activists that actually bulldoze their way into an event in let's say, the Catalan embassy in Madrid. Mm-hmm. 4 or 5 years ago.
I remember seeing the tapes. They broke the microphone and waved Spanish flags and
absolutely shocking, absolutely. But 1 or 2 of them are related to people in high places, and the Constitutional Court said, well, you have to bring down the sentences, among other things, because there was no ideological discrimination involved. Well, I mean, you know, I can't imagine a more ideologically loaded act than that one. So, you know, a justice does justice exist? Another former Catalan minister, Laura Borràs, who's just gone on trial, she said, well, she went to a preliminary hearing in Madrid yesterday, and she said she's quite willing to cooperate with la justicia, with the justice, but not with injustice. So it kind of summarizes it. However much you would like to believe that Spain is a consolidated democracy, what it is doing, trying to decapitate more and more the Catalan independence movement is absolutely shocking. It's unheard of in let's say, in Western Europe since the Second World War, at least.
Yeah. And what is the talk to us a little bit about the scandal with the former king Juan Carlos. It turned out that he has like millions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts and a mistress that he gave like six. Well, tell us about what's going on with the former king.
Well, the Catalan Parliament wanted actually to discuss this because he's king of Catalonia as well. But that was banned by the Constitutional Court, so there was no investigation there. It was turned down by a majority in the Spanish Parliament. So let's say in parliamentary terms, there's just no issue. However, it was a UK newspaper that revealed that this gentleman, the former king, who was actually, I think he was born in Italy, doesn't matter, had accounts in Switzerland and had dealings with a lady, a very pretty lady, and gave her a very substantial, let's say, bonus, probably for her silence. She has been to the courts complaining that she's been harassed by Spanish secret police, and her life has been threatened, so that she's constantly has bodyguards. But it's only thanks to, as I say, a UK newspaper revealing what is going on now in Switzerland, because the Swiss courts are now beginning to look into this, that it might be the case that a head of state, the former head of state, who enjoyed absolute immunity while he was head of state, might, presumably for activities that carried on after he abdicated, will end up in court in Spain. Mm-hmm. But of course, can you allege immunity in Spain before a Swiss court for not paying taxes? I would argue that you can't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and has any of this spilled over to the have there been any accusations against the current king, or and I know that he paid a visit to Catalonia and was about as popular as Boris Johnson coming to Scotland earlier today. So tell us about the protests against the king's visit, and whether there is any evidence currently against the current king in terms of corruption.
The current king tried to, let's say, divorce himself from the financial dealings of his father, and said that he renounced the inheritance as a block, as a whole. So he did that pretty quickly when rumors started, let's say, well-founded rumors started circulating. And he's just become even more unpopular in Catalonia. Don't forget, on 2 days after the referendum, he made an extremely aggressive speech threatening the Catalan people and more or less letting the military and let's say the police and the judges out to catch whatever they could. So he was already unpopular in Catalonia. And I think the whole Republican movement, the Catalan Republican and Spanish Republican movements have been heating up. He decided after lockdown finished to visit each of the regions of Spain in, let's say, solidarity, and have a drink at the bar with his wife, to recreate normality. And several weeks ago, his visit to Catalonia was announced, and he was going to go to Barcelona and Figueres and 3 or 4 places. But the uproar was just so great that in the end, he more or less crawled into a state-owned monastery in Western Catalonia, which is about 5 miles from the nearest town. Nevertheless, several thousand people walked towards the monastery, and there they were held up by the Catalan police, and the instructions were, well, the royal family will let people in if they have a Spanish flag to wave in favor of us. And if anything, that was what appeared in the Spanish media. And the several thousand people outside, well, some of them had, let's say, a rough and tumble with the police there. So let's say that Spain is doing everything as badly as it can, unfortunately. It's not attenuating, it's not compromising, it's not trying to find a solution for the Catalan conflict, even though even a year and a half ago it signed a declaration saying there was going to be a negotiating table, we're going to sit down, thrash it all out and try and find a political solution to what I insist is a political problem. Then they reached agreement again because they were forced to in the Spanish parliament, and they had one meeting, and then the lockdown came. So, but lockdown ended, you know, a couple of months ago in Spain, and this mesa de diálogo, table of dialogue, has simply not emerged.
And has there been any let up? I mean, I'm assuming the answer is no. But under Sanchez, I mean, after all, his government depends on Catalan. You know, Catalan. Is there any indication that they're doing anything differently than they would if the Catalans were not not supporting the current government?
In practice, I would say no. In practice, I would say no. I mean, the state attorney is supposed to be independent, let's say, of executive power, but and the chief of the attorney's office was changed, but their job has continued to be to chase up and accuse and take to court Catalan political leaders. They fail to understand that this is a bottom-up movement. They think that they can decapitate it, and they have been trying to, and steadily more so. Our current president could well find that he's been disqualified for not removing a banner for freedom of speech and freedom of political prisoners, because the electoral board told him to do that. Well, who was the electoral board to restrict the freedom of expression of anybody? I'm going to say the president. No, of anybody. So again, you find that things are let's say in abeyance. I mean, you're in a state of flux. We don't know when the elections are going to be. Are we going to have to wait for the Supreme Court to confirm that his disqualification comes into effect? Because it's up to the Catalan president only to call an election on paper. It did happen in 2017 because it was called by the Spanish government. But what will happen this time? So I imagine they will, I would say any Supreme Court would say, naughty, you shouldn't have done it, 50 euros fine, but carry on, you know. I mean, don't let that completely block Catalan politics. But this is not a typical court. This is, as I say, a vengeful, politically motivated court.
Okay, and what is just talk to us a little bit about the coronavirus response, from the government. For example, in the UK, Wales is doing a distinctly different policy from England and Scotland. And Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have been much more successful than the UK government. But it is. To be fair, it is recognized as distinct policies that, Scotland has its policy, Wales and the UK government doesn't contest that. How is it working? How is that functioning in Spain?
Well, from March, there was a sort of strict and utter re-centralization of the whole of the machinery to cope with the the coronavirus. So that led a lot of Catalans and Basques and others to complain that, you know, we can cope on our own. There's no need to wait for instructions from Madrid. Given that, the Catalan president insisted that his specialists were calling for a complete lockdown, not a partial lockdown, which was declared in mid-March, but a complete one. And that one came at the end of March and linked up quite happily with the Easter break. Okay, so
and when you say complete lockdown, is that obviously with the exception of going to the store and buying groceries?
Well, it's with the exception of essential commodities. So let's say the production of food products and obviously the sale of food products or cleansing materials, that carried on. And from the people's point of view, you could go out to a shop, you could, but a lot of I mean, all clothes shops, for instance, closed down, restaurants closed down, bars closed down. So let's say there were very few outlets for basic essential goods. Mm-hmm. Then let's say the virus didn't affect all areas of Spain in the same way. There's a very good study showing that if you look at how many commuters there are into and out of Madrid every day, every week, and you put on top of that the map of where at least in the initial phases, the big outbreaks occurred around Madrid, which was obviously the hub of the coronavirus pandemic. You could see areas of Spain far away from Madrid and Catalonia, that were hardly affected. Galicia in the northwest, Asturias right in the north, and amazingly Andalusia in the south, mm-hmm. Which had very, very low rates. Right now, where the regional authorities are in control once more of most of the whole management of the pandemic, we're finding that, for instance, Madrid and Aragon are getting a lot more new hospital entries, a lot more people into intensive care units than Barcelona. Catalonia is probably the fifth on the list, mm-hmm. Even in absolute terms, and Catalonia is probably the second or third largest region in Spain. And yet there are far more new cases in Catalonia than in Madrid. Mm-hmm. You think, well, who is declaring, who is deciding where there are new cases or not? And it seems as though screening in Madrid is hardly operative at all, and that they are hiding what really is a very large second wave of COVID-19 cases. And you were when we were speaking before, you were talking about the Spanish court reaction to some of the measures that were imposed, that the Catalan government imposed. Can you give us a couple examples of that and how they've sought to overturn the decisions that the measures that the Catalan government has taken? Okay, that has finally been sorted out. However, yes. When you have a pandemic, obviously, the quicker you move, the better. If you can move in 24 hours, you'll probably save a lot more contagion than if you wait 72 hours. So the Catalan government locked down several areas in particularly rural Catalonia for separate reasons. And then that was challenged by the state attorney before the courts. And the initial local court upheld the view of the state attorney. In other words, told the Catalan government that it couldn't take those measures because they went against human rights or whatever, and you need a state of alarm to be able to restrict people's fundamental rights. That has been sorted out, but basically in the form of the Catalan government being able to make very strong recommendations, but not be able to punish anyone for not following them.
Okay. We also, and then there's the phone hacking scandal, which I know involved our mutual friend Jordi Domingo and others, and they were apparently using Israeli spyware to hack into the phones of that. And there had been calls even in the Spanish Parliament. I think that Podemos was advocating having some kind of investigation. Do you think that'll go anywhere? And start talking. I'll be right back. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, this is software that's implanted into phones, obviously mobile phones, and it's called Pegasus. And it's very easy to install, and it's very easy to delete, apparently. And there was a leak from the firm, I think by a former employee, with a list of people, mainly politicians, but also businessmen, whose phones had been tapped in this way. Tap means basically all the content could be emptied and used by the recipient. Now the firm, the manufacturer, claims that its only clients are national governments. And, I can't imagine the government of Iceland having much interest in the conversations of a close colleague of President Puigdemont, or of Speaker Torrent, or of several other Catalan independence leaders. So it's fairly, let's say it's fairly clear that this was a purchase by the Spanish government. And of course, as you can imagine, the Spanish government denies all knowledge of this. Let's say it could be legal if a judge authorizes a phone to be tapped, but there's no evidence that any judges were involved, and obviously it really is almost impossible probably to know how much damage, how much people's personal rights to privacy were breached by this particular Pegasus application.
And what's the current status on the extradition? I believe Clara Ponsati, they dropped it because she has immunity, and I'm assuming is that the case with Puigdemont and Koeman as well, and what about the other people for whom Spain is seeking extradition?
Well, let's go back one step, because the most interesting one is former Vice President Junqueras, who is an MP and MEP, sorry, and a consolidated MEP. But in December, the Spanish Supreme Court again overturned a ruling of European Court of Justice and said, no, what you say only applies until the sentence of the court on the independence movement was issued. Well, it was to be applied before that. So I mean, it really is a quite scandalous interpretation of the European Court of Justice ruling. Having said that, so we're waiting for the court again to say, hey, stop being naughty. Comply with my very clear instructions. Let this man go. Let him take office in the European Parliament, and let him act on behalf of the people that voted for him. In the meantime, you have, as you say, several other MEPs whose immunity can only be quashed by a decision of the European Parliament. and a committee is studying those requests for removal of immunity, and only if those requests were granted could proceedings go ahead once again for their extradition. To be honest, Mark, the way the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court are behaving, even with bad translations, I don't think does much for the prospects of their requests actually being heeded in the courts. Mm-hmm. However, in the European Parliament itself, it's politics, and I imagine that the people involved won't be able to amass enough support to be able to turn down the request for their immunity to be removed. Okay. There's another case also, sorry, the former Minister of Culture, who is not an MEP, and his extradition has been requested, and I think it's more or less been put in abeyance while the others' requests are in the channel, because obviously anything affecting him would affect the other three former members of the government who are now MEPs, and the judge obviously doesn't want to offer an opinion before the moment when all four can be treated equally. Several people in exile. You know, who is in exile from a West European country in 2020? You know, it's kind of Julia Assange level of scandal, put it that way. And there's one rap singer who says, you know, I was 17 when I wrote a song against the king because he's corrupt and he steals money. And it turns out that, you know, once I've got the sentence and they've asked for me to be extradited to serve my sentence, it turns out all I said in that song was true. In other words, he is a thief, and so on. So the incongruities are even greater than that. Yeah. And then there's a guy who fled also into Belgium, and then there's a political leader in Switzerland. Switzerland, I don't think, accepts extradition requests on political grounds. Mm-hmm. So she is more or less safe there. Mm-hmm. But it's all extremely sad and pathetic.
What is the evolution of the majority in the Catalan Parliament? You mentioned that there might be an election this coming fall. How do you see the evolution of the parties and whether they are likely to get an even bigger independence majority, or how do you see the evolution of the pro-independence political parties in Catalonia?
In terms of electoral prospects, let me start the other way. I would imagine I would not be at all surprised if sectors on the non-independent side who were mobilized by a frenzy of propaganda into voting for the very first time against independence in 2015 and 2017, I wouldn't be surprised if many of those stayed back at home. Mm-hmm. Most of them voted for a party, Ciudadanos, which has just collapsed. I mean, it was butter and someone turned the gas on, you know, and it just
took a flame torch to it.
Pretty well. Well, I think it was kind of internally started as well. That would mean there are lots and lots of. In fact, no one got more votes in the last election than they did on that particular occasion. So that means there are an awful lot of voters in Catalonia who must be extremely disgruntled by the way they voted last time. I imagine again that they won't be worked into a frenzy to go and vote. mean, last time it was more or less, how do we vote? Where do we have to go? So what do I do with this voting slip? Many people who had never voted before. I think a lot of those will stay at home. That would do the independent side, obviously, a lot of good, even though it needs to coalesce. Mm-hmm. You have basically three main parties. You have the more radical COOP, mm-hmm. Left-wing group. I think they're likely to recover because they did fall back last time.
Then you have in 2016 they had 10 seats and then they went down to 4 after them. Is that right? They went down to 4. Yeah, that's right.
If it wasn't 10, it was I think it was 10 to 4, something like that. Yeah. Then you have Esquerra, which is it was founded in 1936, I think. It's a very long-standing party, which has been hammered for some of its decisions in the last few months by Catalan pro-independent supporters on Twitter. Now, I don't know, how close to real life Twitter is. I mean, if Twitter is anything to go by, they will lose a lot of votes next time, mm-hmm. and there are a number of good reasons for that. But I doubt whether Twitter has really reflects the true balance or weight of each of the options. Mm-hmm. And the other option really has a name, which is Carles Puigdemont. I think it's quite likely that he will lead the party again, as he did in 2017, and did better than Esquerra unexpectedly. But when I say I expect him to lead it again, I don't necessarily think that he will risk returning to be arrested by the Spanish police, because despite the immunity of his person as an MEP, affecting the whole of the European Union, it doesn't affect Spain. In other words, they didn't withdraw the search warrant in Spain. That is absolutely illegal. I mean, how can you possibly justify that before the international authorities? He's immune, so please don't arrest him. But if he comes here, we shall. This is again another crazy one. How well he will do depends partly on how well his new party will coalesce and will bring together the parliamentary group, which in itself is a coalition of parties, and whether the former Convergencia party and its followers, whether they try and stand for election as well. That would make things much more uncertain.
Yeah. And what are the provisions for voting, obviously during a pandemic? I mean, is there mail-in, or does everybody have to go unless you're an absentee? I mean, how does that work? Can people vote by mail, or obviously preferably by computer, by blockchain? But what is the? I mean, will people have to go to the polls during a pandemic?
Well, there are two precedents, actually. Both the Basque Country election and the Galician election were called immediately before the lockdown. And then they said, right, no election now. We'll have election after the lockdown is finished. So that's what they did, with a small problem. And that was a couple of new outbreaks of the COVID virus, in one in each area, and they actually confined people in those areas, so they couldn't leave their homes, and particularly people who were positive couldn't leave their homes to go and vote. So in fact, thousands of voters couldn't exercise what is a very fundamental right. And, you know, the Spanish court said, fine, no problem. So, you know, they can do away with the rights of tens of thousands of people, you know, with a swish of their feather hat. Yeah. So there is that precedent. People that signed up to vote by mail, which is a possibility, and which I think had increased in both areas, had already voted. So there's no problem there. But there was not enough time for them to re-enroll to be able to vote had they not signed up beforehand. So that means that voting by mail, which could have been a very good solution in the lockdown area, the new lockdown areas, couldn't work. And don't even mention blockchains or electronic voting or anything like that, because that simply has not been brought in yet, despite, I think, plenty of evidence that it can work and it does work, and that it can encourage people to take part in not only elections but in other parliamentary decisions, well, let's say political decisions as well. Okay. How are you doing in Scotland?
Well, let's see. At this point, there will be an election in May of this coming year, and people are looking to it to get the SNP to get an even bigger parliamentary majority. And this covers a part of the question of whether Scotland will become independent, and how best people. I'm not quite sure I understand this question, but how do you think Scotland will achieve its independence, and how best can the people's sovereignty help? I'm going to rephrase that a little bit, and just to see, because Scotland they had the claim. There's the claim of right that was reaffirmed a couple of years ago, even in the Westminster Parliament, is basically saying that Scots have the right to decide on their own future. But the Spanish government has done absolutely everything they could to even deny that, you know, for the Catalan people, including in 2010. When they when the Supreme Court decision over the Estatut, which was basically Catalan's constitution, if you will, under the Spanish government, similar to the Scotland Act there, they negated the idea, even the idea that that Catalan is a nation. Obviously, because if you're a nation, then you're a people. You have the right to self-determination. So, I mean. Is there, I guess, so, I mean, is it safe to say there's absolutely no recognition of Catalan sovereignty by the Spanish state?
Not even recognition that the Catalan parliament talk about it, you know. So it's absolutely crazy system. The Catalan parliament, at least 5 or 6 times, had passed resolutions saying that Catalonia does not renounce its right of self-determination as a people. And okay, resolution, another resolution. No one questioned those. They were not sent by any government to the Constitutional Court. So for nearly 30 years, that was accepted as being reasonable for the Catalan Parliament to argue. But then, as you were saying, from 2010 onwards, things got really rough. So every time the word appears, the word independence appears, then you have judges and ministers and state attorneys basically peeing in the pants, if you'll accept the expression. I think it's fair to say they are really frightened, because if you say the Catalan people do not have the right of self-determination, they can go and vote whatever they like. You just ignore it. But what did they do? They did all they could to try and track down the ballot boxes. They made fools of themselves trying to track down, trying to make sure there'd be no voting.
Even the flyers and the posters, those were like a criminal offense. It was like, you know, finding a ton of cocaine, of finding just the posters that they were going to put up during the.
So, I mean, every step that Spain has taken is saying, we know the Catalan people have a right of self-determination. They're saying that, but it's in actions, not in words. In words, they'll carry on denying as long as they can. So you get to the stage you say, well, how many people are going to go to prison next time? Or a WhatsApp chat here saying the Israeli prime minister or president, I'm not sure, asked a leading Catalan politician saying how many Catalans are willing to die for independence and how many Catalans are willing to kill for independence, and unless you say yes to both, then Catalonia will not become independent. Well, it's a very hawkish, but perhaps pragmatic point of view, because you're not going to find, you'll find people willing to die for Catalonia, but you're not going to find people willing to kill for Catalonia.
Yeah. And with regard to Clara Ponsati, someone's asking the question. I think we talked a little bit about this earlier, but apparently she officially has immunity, and I know the Scottish court ruled that the arrest warrant has been dropped. Can you add anything to that, or is that basically accurate?
Well, I think so. She's basically in the same package, awaiting the judgment of Gulp. Well, she's in a curious situation of being a UK resident, but a representative of Spain, and the UK now leaving the Union, and therefore the European Court of Justice will no longer apply to residents in the UK. It's
pretty unprecedented.
It's a pretty good precedent, but anyway, she's in very, very good legal hands, put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's see, now the polls are shifting in favor of an independent Scotland. Do you think the UK government will follow the same path as the Spanish government to thwart to the Union? I'll just answer myself, and then you can add anything to it. I don't think that the British government, as awful as it is really in a legal position to do the same things that they've done with Scotland. It's been a very different situation for devolution in Scotland, where I mean it's functioned pretty well. There hasn't been a lot, and they haven't. And the UK government has not contested very much of what the Scottish Parliament has done. That's been changing, just in the sense that just recently, in the last couple of days, they've been passing these Brexit bills, and there were some amendments put to it by Joanna Cherry and others, seeking to limit the degree that the UK government can scrutinize the laws that passed by the Spanish government to hold this newly created UK internal market. But I'm not, and so we'll just have to see how that changes, and whether Scotland can become independent before that, which we're working on. And let's see. Sorry. And has Catalonia's government asked the Vatican to intervene? Is there a historical precedent for that?
I'm not aware of any recent moves. I'm pretty sure that in and around the time of the referendum, if the referendum was won, that a number of states were approached to ask them to basically intercede, to act as go-betweens with the Spanish government, which very soon became very clear that it would have to be bullied into sitting down to negotiate a satisfactory settlement on independence. Maybe there were, I'm talking now about nearly 3 years ago, maybe at that time the Vatican, as one of many states, was approached for that reason, presumably through para-diplomatic circles, and probably very, very discreetly, as were many other governments, I imagine.
Yeah, I would question how much that really means in this day and age. I think that the Vatican would be more partial towards the Spanish monarchy simply because of the historical role that they played, and given that that, I mean, technically this, as in the UK, as in Spain, it's still technically divine right. I mean, it's still technically God chose the king, and derives their legitimacy through divine right rather than popular sovereignty. So, and again, I just don't know how much that would mean, even if they did come out on some kind of formal endorsement of it.
Someone, Mark, did point out that the Pope has just celebrated the second centenary of his country's independence from Spain.
Oh, right.
Yes. Argentina. Whether that has any bearing or relevance or not is beyond me.
What are the most recent polls on Catalan independence, and how often do they get published?
Polls are included every 4 months, if I'm not mistaken, in the Center for Surveys and Studies that the Catalan government has. These are always commissioned out to reputable firms, and it does waver a bit, but usually you're finding that there's a slight overall majority of people who say they are in favor as opposed to being against independence. Having said that, in every single poll, depending on how you ask the question, you get different answers. One question I devised, which actually was used by them for several years, was if there were a referendum on independence, what would you do?
Yes.
And there you got people saying, well, I'd stay in bed. You got a lot of people who, if forced to say yes or no, would say no, actually saying, well, they'd abstain. And all, when asked in that way, which is the closest you can get to a real referendum situation, yes, has always won. However, since 2017, that question has been dropped from the this particular survey.
Okay, and in terms of support from people who are ethnically Spanish within Catalonia, and do you think do you see them? I mean, even anecdotally, maybe increasing support for independence just because maybe they're Republicans, maybe they're maybe they just see the state of the Spanish government and say maybe I'm Spanish, but I would be more comfortable under a Catalan government. Is there anything anecdotally or otherwise to suggest that that maybe if the independence were framed in a sense of better governance, that there could be much more support from Spanish people?
It's a very good point. I'd say the framing comes from two different poles. You have the pro-independence movement that has framed the issue in terms of improving people's standard of living and opportunities, and reducing social exclusion, and in many ways the same way that the United States won its independence. The argument was good governance. That's one. But who does that reach, and how does it reach people? It reaches all the people that are convinced, that are sure, but it doesn't reach a huge sector and I'll explain why it's huge, of the population who, as you were saying, have Spanish ethnic origins and who consume media that have bombarded them with an ethnic rationale, accusing the Catalans of being Nazis, of being exclusionary, and of being all sorts of things that we see on the other side, but don't identify with at all. Now that frightened a lot of people. You will lose your nationality, you will be kicked out of Catalonia, you will lose your pension, all sorts of falsehoods that I'm sure influence a lot of people. And
are very familiar to people in Scotland as well.
Well, there we are. And when I say it's a very large bulk of the people, if you look at the adult population and say, you subject in a survey, maybe you were born in Catalonia, maybe you weren't. Maybe your parents were, maybe they weren't. But how about your grandparents? How many of your grandparents were born in Catalonia? What would you imagine? Perhaps a half or something like that. Well, a half, in fact, a bit more than half of the adult population's grandparents were born outside Catalonia. Over half. Yeah. And under a quarter of them will say all 4 grandparents were born in Catalonia. It's a kind of tremendous impact of in-migration from southern and central Spain in the 50s, 60s and early 70s particularly, but which has carried on regardless since then, coupled with lower birth rates. Any number of demographers will tell you about that, and that has meant, let's say, the amount of people to be recruited to the cause is very large, and you find that the longest standing families of Spanish descent have been in Catalonia, the more they favor Catalan independence, the more they have integrated Catalan into the language repertoire, the more integrated they feel. Mm-hmm. So it's the basic problem is people who were not born here, who are radically against, and let's say the first generation of people who were born here, but their parents weren't, and their grandparents weren't either. Mm-hmm. And there is, let's say, the breeding ground for, particularly for the Ciudadanos party, at least in the last regional elections.
All right. Okay. Well, I guess we'll wrap this up. But thank you so much, Miquel, for sharing your insight, and may Scotland and Catalonia become independent soon. I hope that we both see that within our lifetimes.
And I hope so, and I hope they will be the best of allies. Okay. If we can contribute to that as well, and so much.
I don't think there's any doubt. Given when I see the reception for Clara Ponsati at the SNP conferences, I have absolutely no doubt there's a huge amount of support. Okay. All right. Thank you all the viewers, and thank you, Miquel.
Hello, my name's Steve B, and I'm a presenter on IndyLive Radio. I present Music and Musings every Friday night at 7. The music, that's 70s classic rock, although we will take the occasional side road. The musings, well, they're thoughts on Scottish independence, politics and world events from my viewpoint, which is that of a grumpy old man. So join me every Friday night at 7 on IndyLive Radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, this is Marley, and I'm here to tell you a bit about Daytime Live Show, which goes out Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays on IndyLive Radio at 11:30 for a couple of hours. So I present the programme along with Val, and we're there with a variety of guests to chat to each day. Now, at the moment, Wednesday's show is a catch-up edition. It's not live. What we do is we rebroadcast some of the more recent interviews. So we hope we enjoy all of those. Be there at 11:30 on IndyLive Radio for the news you don't hear elsewhere, a new voice for a new Scotland.
film. You can watch this again. You can be part of it. It's Independence Live. Yeah. A few people asked about YouTube. It'll be YouTube/Independence Live. That's where you'll find the footage.
No Westminster, no Westminster, come on. No Westminster, not for me, not for me. But therefore I'll be your slave. I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, come on. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. One more. Oh, freedom over me, over me. But before I be your slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.